He lost his wife and child and lived in silence for many years. One day, he received a letter. His late wife's father had left him an old castle in the mountains. He came to simply sign the papers. But the house was not empty. See what he found behind a door that no one had opened in 20 years. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are watching from. The apartment was too quiet now that he no longer needed to wake before dawn. For the first time in 30 years, Michael Everett didn't have a schedule printed on a government tablet or a coded briefing waiting on his desk. He had only the slow ticking of the clock above his kitchen sink and the weight of a silence that felt less like peace and more like the echo of something that had long since died. The city outside Washington in late autumn was already folding into early darkness, a pale fog rising between the buildings like breath from a sleeping giant. He sat at the table with the same metal mug he had used for 2 decades. The one Emily had once joked looked more like an army ration than a cup. That had been before the hospital, before the sterile light, before the quiet that came after the machine stopped. He thought retirement would feel different. Men he had trained with used to talk about freedom, about escaping the endless reports, the interrogations, the lies hidden beneath patriotic slogans. But for him, leaving the agency had been less of an escape and more of a slow disintegration. There was no wife to share the mornings with, no child to drive to school, no voice in the house besides the creak of old furniture. His colleagues had shaken his hand politely on his last day. A man of precision, one had said. Another added, the agency owes you quiet years. Quiet. They all said it as if quiet was a gift, not a sentence. He had lived 20 years since the night Emily died. She had been 28, radiant and terrified, whispering his name just before everything fell apart. The doctors had tried to sound calm, but he'd seen panic before, in interrogation rooms, in war zones, and he knew the truth before they spoke it. When the baby didn't cry, something inside him folded shut forever. He remembered leaving the hospital with her scarf in his hands, the one she had left in the car. He had kept it for years, tucked in a drawer, like an unburied memory he couldn't quite face. Now, on a gray Wednesday, when even the rain outside seemed tired, a letter arrived that would undo the stillness he had built around himself. The envelope was thick, cream-colored, sealed with a red wax emblem pressed into it, something from another century. His name was written in a hand too deliberate to be from a government file. He slid it open with the edge of a butter knife and unfolded a letter, written on textured paper that smelled faintly of cedar. Mr. Everett, it began, I regret to inform you of the passing of Mr. Arthur Langley, last of the Langley family of Vermont. You have been identified as the legal beneficiary of his estate by virtue of your marriage to the late Emily Langley Everett. The inheritance includes the Langley property, located near the northern ridge of the Green Mountains. Please be advised, access is limited. Your personal attendance is required to complete the transfer. It was signed by a man named Hayden, attorney at law. There was no phone number, no email, only coordinates, written in neat black ink. When he turned the page, something small and heavy slid out. A key made of tarnished brass, long and ornate, engraved with a letter L, surrounded by curling vines. A note was attached, written in another hand, less steady, but more human. Do not sell the house before you understand what Arthur kept. The truth belongs to you now. He stared at the words until the coffee went cold. Emily had never spoken of family. When they met, she told him she had grown up moving between relatives, that her parents were gone, that she preferred not to talk about the past. He had respected that. He knew the value of silence. But the name Langley stirred something faintly familiar. An echo from one of her old letters, a return address he'd noticed and never questioned. That night, he sat at his kitchen table long after the city lights dimmed. The key lay beside his mug, glinting faintly under the overhead bulb. He could almost feel the weight of time pressing through it, as if it carried the fingerprints of a century. He tried to tell himself it was nonsense, that it was only property, something to be signed over and forgotten. But a restlessness grew in him, slow and insistent. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the first spark of something dangerously close to purpose. By morning, he was driving north. The road out of Washington blurred into stretches of bare trees and gray sky. He told himself he was doing it to finalize paperwork, to close another door. Yet with every mile, he felt less certain that this was about bureaucracy. When he crossed into Vermont, the world seemed to thin. Cell service dropped, the GPS flickered, and the highway gave way to a winding road lined with pines, heavy from last night's frost. The silence outside the car was absolute. He reached the small town of Brenton before dusk. It wasn't much more than a main street, a diner, and a courthouse, with a flag that hung stiff in the wind. The law office was on the second floor of an old building that smelled of dust and polished wood. Mr. Hayden was exactly as his handwriting suggested, precise, pale, with eyes that had memorized too many wills. He greeted Michael politely, offered a handshake that felt like an obligation, and laid the documents on the desk. "Mr. Langley passed last winter," he said. "He left no living relatives besides your late wife. That makes you, in the eyes of the law, the sole heir." "I didn't even know she had family," Michael said. "Most didn't. The Langleys were. Private. Reclusive, in fact. The estate hasn't been opened in over 20 years. He paused, studying him. "It's up there." He pointed toward the mountains visible through the window. "Few people go that far anymore." Michael signed the transfer papers with mechanical precision. "What's the condition of the place?" Hayden hesitated. "Structurally sound, though the road is rough. You'll need to hike the last half-mile. Locals say the house sits right on the ridge, built almost into the rock itself. They call it Langley Hall, though some say Langley's Watch. I suggest you go in daylight." As Michael turned to leave, the lawyer added softly, "Mr. Everett, if you hear anything while you're there, don't be alarmed. Old houses have ways of remembering." The phrase stayed with him as he drove up the mountain road. The sun sank behind the peaks, painting the horizon in ash and amber. The car engine groaned on the steep incline, and twice he thought it would die before reaching the top. When the wheels finally spun uselessly in gravel, he stopped. The coordinates on the paper said the rest was to be done on foot. He took his flashlight, the key, and began to climb. The forest was dense, heavy with snowmelt. The air smelled of pine and iron. His breath came out in pale clouds as he followed the overgrown path, boots crunching over roots and stones. Then, through the fog, he saw it. The house emerged like a monument carved from the mountain itself, a vast stone structure with turrets, dark windows, and ivy crawling up the walls like veins. Its outline was both magnificent and oppressive, the kind of architecture that once symbolized permanence, but now looked like defiance against decay. A metal gate hung open, its hinges shrieking when he pushed through. On the door, worn brass letters still spelled Langley. He fit the key into the lock. The mechanism resisted at first, then gave way with a hollow click that echoed deep within. The door opened inward, releasing a breath of cold air that smelled of dust, wood smoke, and something faintly metallic like old blood. He stepped inside. The entry hall was enormous. Faded portraits lined the walls, men in stiff collars, women in lace, all watching him with eyes that seemed too alive for paint. A chandelier hung above, its crystals coated in grime. To his left, a staircase spiraled upward into darkness. He turned on his flashlight and crossed the room. Each step echoed, as if the house were empty down to its bones. In a small sitting room, he found a matchbox and an old oil lamp. When he lit it, the flame flickered and caught on the brass frame of a photograph resting on the mantel. It was Emily. Younger, perhaps 15, dressed in a plain white gown, her hair tied back, her expression solemn. Behind her stood an older man with sharp eyes, Arthur Langley. Michael felt a chill crawl down his spine. It wasn't only that she looked alive in the picture, it was that the air in the room seemed to shift, as if the memory of her presence had weight. He moved deeper into the house. The kitchen smelled of rust and earth. In the library, the air was colder still. He brushed dust off a desk and found a small note written in a shaky hand. The ink had faded, but he could make out the words. "If you're reading this, the house has chosen to open. Some things are not ready for light." He pocketed the note without understanding why. His flashlight dimmed. Somewhere above him, floorboards creaked. He called out a reflex more than courage, but the sound was swallowed by the vastness of the place. No answer came. He climbed the stairs, found a bedroom half-furnished, and decided it would do for the night. He spread his jacket over the bed and lay back, staring at the cracked ceiling. Outside, wind howled through the trees. Inside, the walls seemed to breathe. He thought he heard the soft patter of steps along the hallway light, deliberate, almost childlike. When he rose and opened the door, the corridor was empty. The only thing that moved was the curtain by the window, fluttering from a draft that felt far too warm for the mountain air. He closed the door, sat down again, and rubbed his eyes. "You're just tired," he told himself, though he knew fatigue couldn't explain why the key in his pocket now felt hot, almost pulsing. When sleep finally came, it was uneasy. He dreamt of Emily standing at the end of a long corridor lined with mirrors, each reflecting a different version of her. Smiling, crying, disappearing. She lifted a hand and whispered something he couldn't hear. When he reached for her, the mirror shattered. He woke before dawn, heart pounding, the house utterly still. The lamp had gone out, but the faintest light filtered through the frosted window. It wasn't yet morning, but the world was shifting toward it. He rose, rubbed his face, and looked toward the door. The silence pressed against him, almost expectant. He realized then what the lawyer had meant. The house didn't just remember, it waited. And in that quiet, beneath the hum of old wood and wind, Michael Everett felt for the first time in 20 years that his past was not behind him at all, but waiting in the dark, ready to be found. When morning came, the light felt foreign, like an intruder that had broken through the house's resistance. It crept across the walls, illuminating the faint traces of age, the cracks in the wallpaper, the faded edges of portraits, the dust that floated in the stillness. Michael Everett woke slowly, uncertain for a moment of where he was. The memory of the night before, those steps, the dream of Emily, the pulse of the key returned with a weight that pressed behind his eyes. He sat up, rubbed his temples, and stared at the window, where pale frost had etched delicate veins on the glass. The forest outside lay silent, veiled in mist. The house, in that first light, looked less like a monument and more like a creature caught mid-breath, waiting for him to move. He walked through the halls barefoot, every floorboard groaning as if in warning. In daylight, the grandeur of Langley Hall was impossible to ignore. Carved banisters, stained glass panels depicting mythic scenes, bookcases that stretched to the ceiling, their shelves sagging beneath centuries of ink and paper. Yet what unsettled him most wasn't the decay, it was the meticulous order. Every chair, every candle holder, every clock seemed positioned with deliberate intent, as though someone had left moments ago and expected to return. He tried to shake the feeling that the house was still inhabited, not by ghosts, but by memory itself, thick and invisible as the dust that clung to his coat. In the library, the air smelled faintly of cedar and old tobacco. He lit the oil lamp again and began scanning the shelves. Names and titles blurred together. Volumes on metaphysics, psychology, physiology, and rows upon rows of notebooks bound in worn leather. Many bore the same symbol engraved on the key and ornate L, entwined with vines. On a lower shelf, he found folders stamped with government markings he recognized instantly. It was the language of secrecy, the same classification symbols he had seen during his years in the agency. Project Echo Sequence. The cover read in fading ink. He hesitated before opening it, a flicker of his old training reminding him that curiosity could be a form of trespass. Inside were typewritten pages, diagrams of the human brain, annotations in two distinct handwritings. One was neat and angular, Arthur Langley's, he assumed. The other, smaller and slanted, belonged to someone else. A sentence caught his attention. Transmission through mnemonic resonance remains unstable. Memory can be stored, but not contained. Echo manifests unpredictably. He read it twice, feeling a chill spread through him. It sounded like madness cloaked in science, the kind of theorizing his old department had quietly buried under classified folders. What was a reclusive old man doing with such material? As he turned another page, a photograph slipped out. It showed a young woman, Emily, at maybe 20 standing beside Arthur, in a room filled with equipment that looked both archaic and advanced. Coils, tape machines, and what appeared to be a medical chair wired to a console. Emily's face in the photo wasn't one of fear, but resignation. On the back, in handwriting that could only be Arthur's, were the words, "Subject possesses superior mnemonic retention. Sequence begins tonight." Michael felt the air leave his chest. He dropped the photo as though it burned. He told himself there had to be an explanation. People like Langley, brilliant, obsessive, sometimes blurred the line between research and delusion. But when he found the journals, the truth grew harder to dismiss. The entries stretched over decades, detailing experiments with memory transfer, neurological mapping, and something called conscious echo replication. One passage stopped him cold. The girl has inherited the frequency. Blood carries memory. The transfer must be preserved in the family line. He reread it, his pulse quickening. The girl, Emily, wasn't a participant. She was the experiment. He spent the rest of the morning combing through the papers until the light outside shifted toward afternoon. His head throbbed, his throat dry. He needed air. Taking the car keys from his coat, he stepped outside into the brittle sunlight and drove down the mountain toward the town. The descent was easier, but the road seemed longer, twisting through valleys and ridges that felt subtly altered, as if the land itself was holding its breath. By the time he reached Brenton, the small diner near the courthouse was the only place open. He ordered black coffee, sat at the counter, and tried to quiet the thoughts hammering in his skull. The man who slid onto the stool beside him was old 70s, maybe 80, with skin weathered like bark and eyes that had seen too many winters. He looked at Michael with the faint recognition of someone who's already guessed too much. "You're up at the Langley place," he said, not asking, but stating. His voice carried the dry rasp of gravel. "Haven't seen lights there since before my wife passed." Michael turned to him. "You knew Arthur Langley?" "Knew him enough to stay away." The man gave a short laugh that wasn't humor. "Name's Harold. I kept his gardens before there was nothing left to tend. He wasn't right after his daughter died. Locked himself up there. Said he was keeping the past safe. Folks thought he'd gone mad. Maybe he had." "What do you mean keeping it safe?" Michael asked. Harold stared into his coffee, swirling it absently. He said the house was built to remember, that the stones carried sound. Used to talk about memory, like it was a living thing, something that could bite if you weren't careful. He lifted his eyes then, sharp despite their age. He said blood remembers too. The words struck with strange precision. Michael forced a small nod. Did he ever talk about his granddaughter? Emily. For a moment, the old man's expression softened. A sweet girl. Quiet. Lived there a few years before running off to the city. Arthur said she was special. Smart in a way that scared people. He wouldn't let her go to school. Said he was teaching her things. She couldn't learn anywhere else. After she left, he never mentioned her again. But sometimes, late at night, we heard him talking to her. Harold paused. Only she wasn't there anymore. The bell above the diner door rang as someone entered, and the conversation drifted to silence. When Michael finally looked up again, Harold was studying him. "You'll hear it too," the old man said softly. "That house, it doesn't stay quiet for long." Driving back up the mountain, Michael couldn't shake the unease the conversation left behind. The forest was darker now, the clouds hanging low. When he reached the gate, the first drops of rain began to fall, thin and icy. The house loomed ahead, its windows reflecting the last pale shimmer of daylight. Inside, the temperature had dropped sharply. He lit the lamp in the library again and resumed sorting through the documents. But as the flame flickered, he noticed something he hadn't before. A faint hum beneath the floorboards, rhythmic, mechanical, alive. He followed it down the main corridor, through a door half hidden behind a tapestry, and into the stairwell that led to the basement. The air grew colder with every step. At the bottom stood the iron door he had seen the night he arrived, its surface streaked with rust. He hesitated. Something about it radiated an almost magnetic pull, a promise and a warning entwined. When he pressed his ear to the metal, he could hear it clearly now. A steady vibration, like machinery long forgotten, yet still turning. Against all reason, he used the key. The door released with a deep metallic groan. A gust of stale air swept past him, carrying the scent of oil and dust. He raised the lamp, and the room beyond came into focus. A cavernous space, lined with old electrical panels, glass cylinders, and filing cabinets sealed with wax. On one wall hung a massive map of the human brain, its pathways traced with colored threads. Beneath it stood a workbench, cluttered with reels of tape, labeled boxes, and the remnants of machines he couldn't name. He stepped closer. Each box bore dates spanning decades, some reaching back to the 1940s. On one, written in ink now brown with age, he read, "Project Echo, Phase 2. The deeper he moved into the room, the stronger the hum became. It emanated from a generator in the far corner, still connected to wires that disappeared into the ceiling. He bent over a stack of folders and found one stamped, "Confidential." The first page was a report signed by Arthur Langley himself, dated 1958. Initial success with animal subjects indicates potential for long-term storage of cognitive sequences. Human trials pending. Memory does not die. It merely waits for reactivation. Michael's stomach turned. This was no harmless study. This was obsession-given structure. He began opening drawers, searching for anything that might explain Emily's connection to it. What he found made his hands tremble. A folder labeled Subject 04, EL. Inside were medical charts, scans, and notes describing sessions conducted when Emily was 23, the year before she died. One entry, written in the same sharp hand as the earlier reports, read, "Transfer complete. Neural imprint stabilized. Sequence preserved through genetic resonance. Containment essential. He couldn't read further. The words blurred. The idea that someone, her own grandfather, had turned her into the object of an experiment clawed at his chest. He stumbled back, catching his breath. But then he saw a reel-to-reel tape recorder on the table. A single label. Emily. March 12th. Against his better judgment, he pressed play. For a few seconds, only static filled the air. Then a voice broke through, soft and unmistakably hers. If anyone hears this, it means he finished it. I told him not to. I told him that memory isn't meant to live without a body. I didn't want this. Please, whoever you are, if you love me, end it. Don't let me stay here. Her voice cracked on the last word, dissolving into static. The tape clicked and stopped. Michael stood motionless, the lamp trembling in his grip. The cold in the room felt deeper now, almost intelligent. Every instinct screamed for him to leave, to destroy everything, to pretend this was nothing more than a hallucination born of grief. But another part of him, the part that had spent decades chasing truth through lies, refused to turn away. He scanned the shelves again until his gaze fell on a small metal box tucked behind a row of books. Inside was a letter sealed in wax, addressed to him. He tore it open. The handwriting was Arthur's, though frailer now. You are not here by chance. You were meant to find what I began. Emily was never meant to vanish. She was meant to endure. But I failed her. The house holds her now. Her echoes, her light. Follow the path to the northern tower. The answers are waiting. There was no signature, only a smudge where the ink had bled. He sank onto a nearby chair, the paper trembling in his hands. The silence around him felt charged, like the air before a storm. Somewhere above, he thought he heard the faintest strain of a piano, a melody he recognized from long ago. Emily had played it on quiet evenings, her fingers moving gently over the keys while he read nearby. The notes now came distorted, as if from another room, another life. Clutching the letter, he made his way back up the stairs. The melody stopped as suddenly as it had begun. In the corridor, the air shimmered faintly with dust. He felt watched, but not threatened, as if the house itself were holding its breath for him to continue. He looked toward the end of the hallway, where a narrow staircase wound upward to the tower he hadn't yet explored. The steps were steep, the rail cold beneath his hand. Above him, through a cracked skylight, the last of the daylight flickered like a dying pulse. When he reached the landing, the projector flicked on by itself, flooding the walls with light. And there she was, Emily, standing as she had on their wedding day, smiling faintly, her image suspended in the air like the afterglow of a dream. The sound of his own heartbeat drowned everything else. She turned her head slowly, as though she could see him through the veil of time, and her voice came, faint but clear. "Hello, Michael." The lamp slipped from his fingers and shattered on the stone floor. The image didn't fade. She was still there, waiting. And for the first time in 2 decades, he whispered her name aloud, trembling. Not in disbelief, but in recognition of something impossible that had never truly died. For a long time, Michael didn't move. The projection wavered in the air before him, its light spilling across the stone walls of the tower, casting his shadow long and thin. He wanted to speak, to ask what this was, but the words felt locked inside him. The image of Emily flickered once, stabilizing as if the system were struggling to keep her intact. Her face was illuminated in soft amber, the same light he remembered from the night she had played the piano for him just days before their child was to be born. The illusion was almost perfect. Almost, except her eyes. They were not the bright, living eyes he remembered. They seemed to watch from somewhere far away, as though she existed on the other side of glass. "Michael," she said again, her voice steady now, as if drawn from a recording, but laced with awareness. "You shouldn't have come." He stepped forward, unable to stop himself. "Emily." His throat was dry, and the sound of her name fractured under his breath. What is this?" The figure tilted her head, and the faintest smile passed over her lips. "He built it for me, for us, to keep me here, to make sure memory wouldn't fade. But he didn't understand that some things should end." The light shifted, the air buzzing faintly. Behind her image, other shapes flickered, ghostly overlays of rooms, faces, and fragments of time. He saw Arthur standing in a laboratory, the strange machines from the basement alive with motion. He saw Emily sitting in the chair, her eyes closed, wires tracing down her temples. He saw flashes of light, the shimmer of film reels spinning, and then darkness swallowing everything. The images moved like waves, flowing around her as though the walls themselves were made of memory. Michael's heart pounded. He could feel the hum of the generator beneath his feet, the steady rhythm that powered the illusion. "You're real," he whispered. "Or what's left of you?" Her expression softened. "I'm what he made of me, the echo, the fragments he pulled from my mind before everything ended. But I remember you. I remember our house, the way you looked at me when you thought I wasn't watching, the song you never finished singing." Her voice trembled, and for an instant it wasn't a recording. It was her. His Emily. He wanted to believe it. He wanted to cross the space between them, to touch the air where her hand seemed to reach toward him. But he knew what this was. He'd spent his life dissecting illusions, propaganda, manipulation, codes designed to shape belief. And yet this one felt stronger than all of them, because it was built from love. He took a step closer, his eyes locked on hers. "If you're here, then there's a way to let you rest." The light flickered violently, as if the system were reacting to his words. Emily's form blurred, replaced by sudden images flashing across the walls. Data streams, diagrams, Arthur's handwriting scrawled in desperate loops. "He tried," she said, her voice now layered with distortion. "He thought if he captured every detail, every neuron, every impulse, he could preserve what he lost. But he was wrong. Memory without life is a cage. It feeds on itself. The house feeds on it." Michael felt the weight of the revelation like cold metal pressing against his chest. He looked around the room, realizing the walls weren't just stone. They were panels embedded with cables, circuits that pulsed faintly beneath the surface. The entire house was the machine. Langley hadn't built a home. He had built an engine of remembrance, powered by grief and obsession. He turned back to her, his voice barely more than a whisper. "What do you want me to do?" "End it," she said, "before it becomes something neither of us can control." A surge of static filled the air, and her image fragmented into shards of light. He shielded his eyes, stumbling backward. When the room cleared, the projection had changed. Now it showed Arthur himself, older, gaunt, standing before a camera. His voice crackled through the static. "If you're watching this, I am gone. The system is self-sustaining. It carries her consciousness, or what remains of it, across circuits mapped to memory imprints. I could not destroy it. I could not destroy her. But perhaps you can." The image dissolved into code that crawled across the walls like veins of light. For a moment, Michael could hear two voices, Arthur's and Emily's, overlapping, the man of reason and the echo of love entangled in an endless loop. He felt dizzy, as if the air itself were turning to static. He stumbled down the stairs, the lamp swinging wildly in his hand, its flame sputtering. In the corridor below, the house seemed alive now. Lights flickered along the hall, Faint hums rose from behind the walls, and somewhere, distantly, he could hear a piano playing. He followed the sound through the corridor, past the library and the staircase, until he reached the parlor. The piano sat beneath a window, streaked with rain, its keys pressed by invisible hands. The melody was one he knew, a lullaby they had written together when she was pregnant. His breath caught. Every note trembled with precision, each pause filled with the ache of memory. He sat down slowly on the bench, staring at the keys as they moved. "I'm here," he said softly. "You don't have to keep playing." The music stopped. The silence that followed was heavier than sound. A faint voice seemed to rise from the floor, the same whisper that had haunted his dreams. "You promised," it said. "You said you wouldn't let me disappear." He closed his eyes. "I'm keeping that promise," he murmured. "But not like this." When he opened them again, the room was dark. The lamp had gone out. The only light came from the faint glow seeping up from the cracks between the floorboards. He followed it, prying open a loose plank, until he found a small compartment hidden beneath. Inside was a single black switch, its casing marked with Arthur's handwriting. "Master Control. Neural Link." For a moment his hands froze above it. If he destroyed this, he would end the system. He would end her Echo. But to keep it meant letting her remain trapped in the machinery of the past, half alive, half gone. He stood there, staring at the switch, hearing her voice echo faintly through the walls. "If you love me, let me go." He remembered her last breath in that hospital room, the way her hand had fallen from his, the sound of the heart monitor fading. He had never been able to say goodbye. Perhaps this was his chance. "I love you," he said, and he pressed the switch. The light surged once, blindingly bright, then died. The hum ceased. The silence that followed was total, the kind of silence that carried weight, the silence of completion. He stood in the dark for a long time, waiting for something to change, but the house remained still. When he finally stepped outside, the air was cold and clean, and the first traces of dawn were breaking over the ridge. The fog had lifted, revealing valleys silvered by dew. The world looked almost new. Days passed. He stayed in the house, though it no longer hummed beneath his feet. The walls had gone quiet. The rooms, stripped of their hidden pulse, felt lighter. In the evenings, he would sit by the window of the tower, reading through the journals one last time before sealing them away. He couldn't bring himself to burn them. History, even its darkest parts, demanded to be remembered. But he would not let it define the place any longer. In the following months, he began transforming Langley Hall. He contacted universities, ethical research foundations, and government archivists, offering the property as a center for the study of digital memory ethics. He spoke at small conferences, though he never mentioned the house's true origin. To the world, it became a symbol of responsibility, a reminder that some discoveries should remain human, not immortal. To him, it was simply the place where he had learned to stop chasing ghosts. Each morning, he walked the grounds, pruning the overgrown vines, restoring the cracked fountain, clearing the dust from the hallways. He lived alone, but he no longer felt the isolation that had defined him for so long. The house seemed to breathe differently now, quieter, peaceful, as though relieved of a burden it had carried for too many years. Sometimes, as the sun rose over the mountains, he would catch the faint scent of cedar and smoke in the air, and think he saw a figure standing by the window of the northern tower. But when he looked again, it was always empty. He never spoke aloud to her again, yet he often felt her presence, not in the haunting way of echoes, but in the gentle persistence of memory that no machine could replicate. The way she had smiled when she saw him waiting at the train station, the warmth of her hands on a cold night, the sound of her laughter bouncing off kitchen walls. Those fragments belonged to him, unrecorded, unaltered. That was how he wanted them to remain. On the anniversary of her death, he returned to the tower one last time. The projector was still there, silent and inert. Dust lay over the lenses, the reels unmoving. He touched the cold metal and whispered, "Rest now." As he turned to leave, a faint breeze stirred the curtains. For a heartbeat, the air shimmered with light, and he thought he heard her voice, soft, like the brush of wind through glass. "Thank you, Michael." Then it was gone. He stood at the threshold, looking out across the mountain valley, where morning light spilled like gold through the mist. The world stretched wide and empty before him, not as a void, but as a promise. For the first time since she died, he felt something that resembled peace, not the hollow quiet of before, but a calm born from acceptance. The past no longer bound him. It lived where it was meant to live, inside him, not around him. That night, as he walked through the corridors, he paused in the grand hall where the portraits of the Langley family hung. Their painted faces watched in silence, but he no longer felt the weight of their gaze. He extinguished the last lamp, and the house settled into darkness, not ominous, but restful. He could almost hear the walls sigh, like a long-held breath released. In the weeks that followed, visitors began arriving, the first researchers, curious and cautious. They asked about the house's history, about the man who had left it behind. Michael gave them what records he could, omitting only the details that belonged to him and Emily alone. As they worked, he would sometimes sit outside on the terrace, watching the clouds drift across the peaks. He liked to imagine that somewhere, in the gentle hum of the wind through the eaves, there lingered not a ghost, but a whisper of gratitude. When winter returned, snow fell softly over the ridge, blanketing the roof and softening the sharp edges of the stone. From the road below, the house looked alive again, its windows glowing with the steady light of new purpose. Inside, Michael wrote the final note in his own journal. Memory must serve life, not trap it. To remember is to honor, not to resurrect. He closed the book and set it on the desk beside the brass key that had begun it all. Outside, dawn broke slowly, spilling over the mountains. The house stood silent, dignified and whole. And as Michael watched the first light catch the frost on the window pane, he saw, just for an instant, the faint reflection of two figures standing side by side. Himself, and beside him, the shape of a woman smiling at the sunrise. When he blinked, it was gone, but the warmth of it remained. The house that had once imprisoned the past now held only peace. And in that quiet, Michael Everett finally understood what it meant to be free, not from memory, but through it. If this story moved you, subscribe for more. Watch the next one, and share this video with someone who still believes that every memory holds a truth.